and practices. So I thought I would just start with some personal storytelling. And many of you may resonate with this, especially those that work in philanthropy, that, I didn't enter the philanthropic sector as someone who wanted to work in philanthropy. I entered the sector because I had a personal desire to play a role to make this world a better place. And back in 2005, when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to volunteer in Guatemala, where I spent 6 months learning from an indigenous women-led organization called AFEDES, who at the time were developing economic strategies for indigenous women through a microfinance program to be able to support women to become more economically resourceful and managers for their families at home. And that experience was transformational for me because I got grounded in so many learnings that have stayed with me since. And I learned also so much about historical context in Guatemala, such as the impact of a 36-year armed conflict between 1960 to 1999 that had on indigenous communities, where indigenous men were forced to fight against their own people, leading to generational violence and indigenous women surviving high levels of domestic violence. I learned the historical legacy of discrimination that exists in Guatemala against indigenous communities, even though more than 50% of its population are indigenous peoples. But I also learned something that would inform the approach and orientation I would take into my roles in philanthropy. One was I learned the power of listening. I remember spending hours sitting with Indigenous women who would share stories of their fathers being forcibly kidnapped into the armed conflict war. And after long months of uncertainty, the fathers would return completely transformed from their time away from them. I also learned the value of trust, the act of showing up and being willing to listen and learn. This led me to build strong and trust-based relationships with many Indigenous women and youth in communities where a has worked. I also learned to be humble as I realized soon enough that I was no expert. It was very clear to me that I had no contextual lived experience in Guatemala, and the Indigenous women I met showed me how they were developing and creating solutions to support their peers and communities. I share this personal story because it helped me to create my own value system and commitment to the work that I do beyond this point. And those values are consist of being in service. So what that meant for me is that in my own career path, I wanted to find roles where I could offer support to groups like AFEDES and do that with respect, humility, and accountability. Second was to be a learner, which meant that instead of making assumptions and thinking I know what's going on, I would learn. I would be in constant learning and be also clear about what I didn't know and be open to deepening my learning and growth. And thirdly, centering relationships. What this meant for me was that understanding that relationships take time to build trust, and investing time in these relationships is what helps me learn and understand clearly how I can collaborate more effectively with groups doing the hard work on the ground, building solutions for their challenges. And if you're familiar with the trust-based values, these are very much aligned with with a set of values that are promoted and encouraged to have in order to do transformative philanthropy today. But I was very fortunate to learn this in this transformation experience back in 2005. I then entered the global philanthropy sector, and I was very grateful that my training in the sector really started with a small grant-making organization that respected and valued community solutions and was an organization that was willing to learn and adjust its practices to best support its grantees. This organization was called International Development Exchange at the time, IDEX for short, and then it became Thousand Currents, which maybe some of you are familiar with, which is a global grant maker based in the US, supporting social movements towards solutions on food sovereignty, climate justice, and economic justice. At the time I started with them, they weren't actually supporting just they weren't supporting social movements, they were actually more supporting community-based organizations. And they weren't working in so many countries. At the time, they were just working in 6 countries. But I ended up staying with them for 18 years. 15 years of those, I was with their programs team. And that is where I really got a lot of my experience in trust-based practices and values. I know it's a long time to be in one organization for 18 years, but I think that also gave me the privilege to really be part of this organization's journey that went through trial and error with its grant making practices, regularly applying our learnings to ultimately becoming an organization that had a strong value system and strong relational trust-based practices. I know many of you are here to understand more deeply about trust-based practices, so I will go into that soon. But I thought I would share that personal story as sort of like an example of like, what the trust-based philanthropy sort of wants to encourage is how to integrate those values into the practices that we do. So it's not just we do the practice, but they're ingrained in these really core values that will then also inform other kinds of practices that are the beyond the 6 key ones that I will share right now that are sort of promoted by Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. But those who aren't familiar with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, just to give a really quick description, they are a funder-to-funder advocacy initiative and network that are aiming to make equitable grant making and community accountability the standard of practice for effective philanthropy. They have been around since 2020. They provide tools, they facilitate peer networking, and offer insights and learnings to help funders take steps towards a fully embodied commitment to trust-based philanthropy. Um, I've known them since they started, and I think and Thousand Care was one of the organizations that sort of fed into Trust-Based Philanthropy Project to support them in sort of building the concise tools and methodologies to share with other funders. I will now go deeper into the 6 key trust-based practices. Um, which there are 6 that they have outlined. And I'll start with the practice of giving multi-year unrestricted funding. So multi-year unrestricted funding gives grantees the flexibility to assess and determine where grant dollars are most needed and allows for innovation, emergent action, and sustainability. For me, going back to the example of FEDES, where I volunteered in Guatemala, so this organization, interesting enough, they became a grantee of Thousand Currents. And when I left Thousand Currents, they were still a grantee, which means they had been in a long-term relationship for at least 18 years, and throughout the time had received long-term unrestricted funding. And the lesson that I learned there was that, the journey to having victorious outcomes is long-term and sometimes unpredictable. I had mentioned that AFEDIS work at the time when I volunteered with them, they were developing economic strategies for Indigenous women through a microfinance program. And one of the things that AFEDIS learned after, conducting that program for a few years is that they learned that putting financial resources in the hands of Indigenous women wasn't necessarily making them more safe and healthier at home. Instead, they continued to see the rise of violence against women in home spaces in their communities. So AFEDIS made a decision to switch their focus towards Indigenous women rights with feminist values and remove their microfinance and economic program for Indigenous women. And so with this new focus and restructuring of programs, years later, they were able to ultimately foster an environment where a strong national movement of Indigenous women weavers would emerge. And they have actually done a number of successful wins in Guatemala, passing national policies that protect Indigenous weaving designs. And this all kind of happened in a span of like 10, 15 years, which to me, the value of providing that long-term unrestricted funding was that AFEDIS when they decided to change focus and restructure their programs, they could do that because they were receiving unrestricted funding, which meant they could decide how best to use the funds, and they were able to, instead of having to do things because funders needs, like they were doing things that was more important for the community needs. And ultimately that all led to some key victorious outcomes that had national impact in the years later. Secondly, there's a practice of doing the homework. So what trust-based philanthropy does in doing the homework is to move the onus of work to grant makers. It makes it the funder's responsibility to get to know the prospective grantees, which saves grantees time in the early stages of the vetting process. So for me, there's a responsibility that funders have in terms of understanding our privilege as funders, where we do have time and resources to learn about our prospective grantees. And so that means that we should take the time and the resources to explore ways to make the initial stage of getting to know the prospective grantees in the least burdensome possible way. And what are practical ways to do this? And we should be always asking questions in how do we improve our grant making practices? What are ways to minimize the vetting process? How do you actively go and seek grantees that are beyond your usual circle? So I remember like one time when I had to, look for new grantees in Peru, I actually, maybe like I looked for like what were like some key community or movement spaces where I was going to be able to learn about players in Peru that would align with the criteria that we have, and then go there and meet organizations that could potentially become prospective grantees. So it was a lot like on my end to do the research and to explore like the ways that I can go and find the grantees versus kind of like just sitting back and having grantees trying to approach the foundation. So that's a way for doing the practice of doing the homework. The third practice is around simplify and streamline the paperwork. So organizations spend a huge amount of time on funder-driven applications and reports, which takes time away from their mission-critical work. And streamlined approaches focus on dialogue and learning can pave the way for deeper relationships and mutual accountability. So here, the question to ask is, well, what paperwork could you request from grantees that may already exist in the organization that they can share with you? So this could be, they could already have a proposal report that they spent already a large amount of time writing for and has all the description of the work. Like, why not just ask them to share that? At Thousand Currents, the model was to go into long-term relationships with grantees. So the way that we were practicing streamlining paperwork was to say that at the front end, we were going to spend a lot of time in getting to know the organization and to get to know them, to know how they align with the criteria. The onus was on Thousand Currents as a funder to really write up the alignment with the criteria and have those conversations. And then that meant that because all of that streamlining was happening at the front end, we would not ask that much afterwards in the long-term relationship. And in fact, we still had a practice of like asking for an annual report, but again, it's like we were asking like, what is the minimal, like what is actually the key questions we wanted to ask? And we decided that really like there was only one key question we wanted to ask, which is what you would like to share about your work. So we minimized all the reporting questions just had one question. And there was even an option that you could just share like a report that you had made for another funder in replacement of the report to us. So those are the ways of thinking about how to simplify and streamline the paperwork. The fourth practice, which is about being transparent and responsive. So open, honest, and transparent communication supports relationships rooted and trust and mutual accountability. So in practice, I will say that, these are key elements to building long-term trusting relationships with the grantee. It's really, I have found that it's really important to share clearly to the grantee, like who you are as a foundation, like what is your work approach, what is your criteria, like just being super clear and transparent about who you are and what you prioritize, and that helps to build that trust with the grantee at the front end. And then being responsive is a way to indicate to the grantee that they are a priority, right? The relationship that you have with them is a priority. And in practice, this was happened at Thousand Currents, we would have an accountability practice on this, which is that when a grantee would email you, you had to respond to them within 48 hours. Um, I know it sounds very like technical, but it actually really like it helps to set a cultural practice of like partners are a priority. Therefore, those are the communications we'll respond to first. The fifth practice is around soliciting and acting on feedback. So this goes to saying that philanthropy doesn't have all the answers. Grantees and communities provide valuable perspectives that can inform a funder strategy and approach, and inherently making our work more successful in the long run. So in practice, one of the ways that I've seen this work, especially when it comes to like building strategy, is to include your grantees' input from the very beginning of the strategy building process. And how we would do that is that, program officers would consolidate learnings that they had from the grantees over the time that they've been in a relationship with them. And then after that consolidation into a regional strategy, we would share that back to the grantee so that they can give input and see if what we had written up actually aligned with their approach and their way of thinking. And then all of these regional strategies would then get consolidated in one programmatic strategy. And then that would actually be the initial step for building a strategy in a whole organization. And so that's one way that you could put that in practice. Currently at Global Fund for Children, where I'm at now, we do annual partnership surveys where we collect feedback from partners around like how we're doing, what can we do better. And we've been hearing back from the grantees that they want to understand more clear about the model that we have and the ways of working. So we're actually, in response to that, we're actually in a clarification process at the organization to really identify our key practices and approach as a responsibility to report back to the grantees. And then the last practice, the sixth practice, which is to offer support beyond the check. I think I will just continue. I think so. There's the sixth one, which is about offering support beyond the check, is about, funders being able to offer more than just the money alone. Responsive, adaptive, non-monetary support bolsters leadership capacity and organizational health. So this area of what a funder can offer that is beyond just a grant can look very differently depending on the needs of the grantees and the strength of the foundation. So at Thousand Currents, what we did in practice was we recognized that we as funders had access and relationships to many private foundations that would not normally want to give grants through an intermediary funder. So they wanted to go directly to the grassroots group. So what we would do is build relationships with those funders and as a way to build trust. And then we would then facilitate a process to recommend our grantees to that funder if we saw alignment with our criteria. And because of the trust that we built with that foundation, there were many successful moments where our grantees became their grantees. Other practice can also include like helping, to review or give input to a proposal that a grantee wants to share with another funder, and they trust you to kind of give your input on that. At Global Fund for Children, we actually identify like what are some regional based workshops that are on organizational development themes that we can sort of support and coordinate to have our grantees go to. And those are for strengthening a capacity that the grantees would like to grow in, such as financial literacy, fundraising, or general organizational strengthening work. So I'm going to conclude there. I think what I want as key takeaways here to share is that, trust-based philanthropy combines practices with a set of values that acknowledges that as funders, we can have a different way to approach philanthropy that is not traditional. And by traditional, I mean there's been a long history of philanthropy having transactional relationships with grantees where funders don't listen, don't engage grantees into their strategies or practices. They're very extractive. They ask grantees for a lot of information, have them go through a lot of steps and processes before receiving a grant or even ultimately receiving a very small amount of grant. And also traditional grant making concentrates power in the funder, and trust-based philanthropy is constantly challenging that. They're looking at how to redistribute that power by acknowledging who is actually the holders of the power of knowledge, who are the ones who hold the power of knowing how to develop the most effective solutions and the power to have decision making on using funds for their organization. And so by leaning towards a relational and trust-based approach where we are constantly listening, learning, and trusting the grantee, we are practicing grant making in a way that is more effective to them and that we can actually ensure there are victorious outcomes that actually would benefit all of us in the end. So yeah, so thank you very much. And I'm happy to hear for questions or reflections from y'all.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Katherine, for that. Firstly, for sharing your experience. It shines a light on what philanthropy should look like beyond the principles and what is on paper. So, and it also helps us to be able to trace these principles indeed back to values, because at the end of it all, our values should align with the work that we do. So thank you for sharing your experience and also for sharing the trust-based philanthropy principles. And on this call, we may have very few people from foundations, but the majority of the people on this call are from INGOs who act as intermediaries and also community-based organizations. So indeed, you'll find that trust-based philanthropy is not a very common topic from that level of the development ecosystem as you come down. But one thing that we again start to appreciate is that trust is a basic in development work. It should be the basic standard, yeah? It should be the basic standard. And because a lot of us now are working and advancing locally led development, so we are playing the part of the funder, yeah? We are playing the part of the funder because we are acting as intermediaries, the INGOs, and subgranting or extending money down to the locally led organizations. But how does that relationship, that partnership between you, the INGO, and the CBO play out? And that is where the discussion of trust indeed also becomes very, very important, and especially for the fidelity of the partnership and the effectiveness of that partnership. And that is one of the reasons that we decided to initiate these conversations on trust, because I am a development worker myself. I have been in the development sector for the last 15 years, and trust is not something that is commonly discussed here. But also you'll see that a lot of development work it has a lot of hierarchies on who defines the solution, who has the expertise, and how are locally led organizations positioned to contribute. And then in the end, you see that a lot of that to affect the results that are sustained in the community, but also what the community eventually benefits from the relationship. So I want to put it forward to everyone on the call, and I think we'll take some reflections, some questions. If you're hearing about trust-based philanthropy for the first time and you're wondering how you can be able to implement it in your work at the level of organization that you're working in, and how that could play out, you can just drop your reflection in the chat. Also, just put up your hand and submit. Would love to hear your voice. Okay, so I'll just look into the chat, and as I do that, one of the things that for me keeps running in my mind. So I will take, I think, let me take Jackie. Jackie's hand is up as I go through the chat. Jackie, you can just unmute and make your submission.
Thank you so much, Imelda, and thank you so much, Katherine, for that wonderful conversation. I I think, Katherine, this is the first time I'm as somebody who is into social enterprise, being involved in such an honest conversation among the funders, the grantees, and every other philanthropist out there, because they hardly understand. I don't think they haven't gone through a lot of applications in my own avenue, because I'm also a media practitioner. So I deal a lot with all these grants and applications. Catherine said it all. It's so sad that most times they just value us on 10-minute speech, 5-minute speech, where most times if they are doing it online, even they found that it's so at on age, or doesn't even have a steady internet to express him or herself. If they can get down to that, you know, have a sincere personal conversation, ask, what are you doing? I would just want to know what you are doing. What is your organization all about? What are you doing in your community? That is a heart-to-heart conversation. They will really understand more what or where they are spending their money than. In fact, most of the times when they send you an email, I mean, it's like they are communicating with a robot. They don't even put names. They just, it's so, and here you are, a young woman, a young man, you're striving, you're passionate about impacting lives, and out there, I mean, you're just struggling to rend your voice for somebody to hear you. I think I want to appreciate all of you for bringing up this, and it's really, really impactful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Catherine, would you want to take them all at a go? And again, these are reflections, and feel free to just add on what everyone else has said. Should we take Innocent and Chloe? Then we have a discussion after.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So we can have Innocent and then Chloe, and then we'll take those and get back to the chat and see what we can explore there.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Imelda. Thank you so much, Kathleen. When you are talking about Guatemala, I didn't want you to stop, because it was an amazing story. How you had to come from wherever you are to go on ground and engage with the people that needed support and listen to them so that you could get their views so that you could be able to help them. Now, the challenge we have, I work in the health sector, and the health sector has largely benefited from philanthropy. We get money from Global Fund, we get money from previously USAID. But the biggest issue we have for people that get this money is sustainability, because it is a top-down funding system. It is the recipient of aid meeting the needs, of the donor. And the question we keep asking ourselves for people who receive this money, at what point is it going to be relational, as you said? At what point does it become collaborative? At what point do our needs become a priority? And we have seen it time and again that a lot of money is injected, particularly in Africa, and I suppose the same applies to Guatemala. 10 years down the road, you can't find evidence of that money. Billions of dollars that come in aid. And the question we keep asking ourselves, where is the problem? Is the problem the recipient of aid, how aid is structured, or the donor? So when we begin to have these breakthrough conversations, I think that for us, the recipient of aid, I think, becoming brave to start asking questions 10, 20, 30 years ago, we could not ask because we felt if we ask these very intimate, let me use that word, we might lose the money. It's like you questioning the person feeding you, why are you feeding me this way? But I'm glad that we are overcoming the boundaries, the fear, and we are beginning to ask. Yes, we do not have enough. We are hungry. We are sick. We don't go to school. We are struggling with drought. We don't have access to clean water. We don't ABCD. And there you are with resources to help us. But maybe you're giving us bread. Well, actually, all we need is millet. So you bring a very, very, and I'm glad that it's even you. You bring a very, very important conversation here that as people in the developing world, we ought to raise, above the tides, above the fears, and begin to ask for how long again is this going to continue? I think the allied community is rising up, and I'm glad that we have PRA and other philanthropy trust institutions that are coming on board to begin to ask, when do we move from the traditional way of saying, you know what, put your hands there and I'll serve, to a point where we say, can we have a relationship? Can we have a mutually inclusive? Can we have a conversation? And I get it. I like the point where you said, while you were in Guatemala, you moved away from this extractive reporting where it is, bottom up, to where you're saying, tell me how, the previous organizations you worked with, how things went. You're moving away from, 100-page report to saying, how does it work? Is it working? And how can we fix this? So I am really, really happy for the presentation. I don't know whether PRA gave you enough time, but for me, it should have been more than how much they gave because it is so insightful. And I'm glad that you accorded us this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Innocent. I see a lot of submission on relationships, on listening to community. Let's take one from Chloe, and then we will discuss around those and get back and take. I see your hand. I see Caralo. I hope I mentioned right. I also see some in the chat. I will get back to those. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you so much, Imelda, for the invitation, and also Katherine for the great presentation. And really for this group, I'm really grateful to be part of the discussion today. Just to be quick, because I know many have questions. Basically, I also come from local organization experience for 2 years in Peru. And I think that really helped me afterwards when I was at DG ECHO, at a big donor at the European Commission, to better understand what it means to do all this reporting and all of that for them. So my question is a bit like, I saw many officials, in a big donor group. So it's not quite the philanthropy, sorry, but it's kind of similar discussion about the grand bargain and all this, transformative change. I'm just wondering to which extent we could be quite innovative and creative about, for instance, having a kind of role play where a representative could actually sit, for a few days and just understand what it means to reply to these requirements, or, any kind of, creativity around that would be really helpful, I think. And from the other way around, like to understand from the grassroots organization that sitting at a donor funder desk means also responding to a lot of questions from the parliament, from taxpayers. And I really believe in this kind of like going further into this exchange to better understand one another. Just more reflection. And thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chloe. So I think we'll reflect on those, and then we can take others. And over to you, Katherine, and I can pick up at any point as well.
Thanks so much for sharing your reflections. I think, I didn't touch about this piece, but there is also, a power analysis around how philanthropy, like what is philanthropy and why it exists and should it exist, right? Because and I don't know, and I don't know if there's similar conversations happening with development aid to an extent, but I think in philanthropy, you know, there is a you could say a top-down reason for how it existed in terms of offering, at least what I'd say in the US context, offering a lot of wealthy people a way to sort of evade taxes, you could say, by building their own foundations and concentrating their wealth in foundations and concentrating their power, right? So there is this extractive nature of philanthropy, right? Because where did all that money come in the first place, right? These come from a legacy of, of extractive labor in all different ways. And so I think there's a political analysis that I just want to throw in here around philanthropy. And so I guess what I can say in terms of how maybe the trust-based lens and approach can help is and I say this because this was like what we discussed when I was at Thousand Currents, is like, how do you recognize that there is this historical legacy around philanthropy? So how do we use that as a tool to be able to mobilize resources to community-led solutions that are effective and long-term, right? And how do we do that in a way that that is relational and allows, that actually encourages organizations and grantees to use the money in the ways that they know it's best used for, right? And I think there is a larger conversation around like, should philanthropy even exist? But it does exist now. So it's like we're in a contradiction of like at least for those who work in philanthropy, it's like we want to build a better world. That better world should not have philanthropy, because that means the power and wealth has been redistributed in a way that those who are at the community level, have all their needs met. And so I think I just share that because I think that those conversations should also happen. And at the same time, they were also trying to challenge traditional forms of philanthropy. There's an alternative way that is much more relationship collaborative and more effective. And then we still need to consciously understand the continual power that philanthropy holds. So I just wanted to reflect that back from some of the thoughts that were shared.
Thank you. Right. Thank you so much. And for me, I really like that you share it from a point of philanthropy. Indeed, when you look at that point of philanthropy, these discussions are happening. People are looking at how do we reform how philanthropy is being done. But when you come down to the bigger part of the development sector and the development and humanitarian aid, those discussions are not as loud as they are at foundational level, at foundational funder level. But at the end of the day, we are trusting the organizations that we are going to work with on the ground, whether they are intermediaries or CBOs, to be able to translate the values that we are advocating for from the top down to the communities that we are working with. And I think for me, it really echoes the importance of having these discussions flow all the way through the humanitarian and development ecosystem, the discussions around shifting power. And I think it's also what Innocent insinuated, listening to community. There are a whole lot of movements around listening to community, but it plays around the foundations. These discussions have to come all the way down to the community-led organizations, to the intermediaries, because that's when we start to see collective change here. But Chloe mentioned something around just putting yourself in the shoe of the other person. Yeah, putting yourself in the shoe of if you are the funder. And I think it's good that you shared your own experience about acknowledging in humility that at a particular context, you needed to learn from that community. And those are the kind of reflections that a lot of us really need to have. It is really in humility. I read a book that says, "But I meant well." And it just emphasizes that not not all good intentions eventually lead to good outcomes. And when we get to a point where we are able to reflect that from a point of humility, then we start to see things differently. Over to you, Esikaralu. And then just before you come in, let me read one or two reflections from the chat. So Mamta says, Imelda, can you share a personal experience where trusting a partner changed the outcome of a project in a negative way? Yeah. Okay. I will get to that, Mamta. And then Festo says, what is the picture of philanthropy in Africa, and what can be done to make aid flexible without conditionalities of results-based frameworks and log frames? So let's take one from Asika Ralu, and then we can reflect on those three. And I think we'll see what time we have left. Over to you.
Thank you, Imelda, for giving me the opportunity to talk. Talking about trust-based philanthropy, I really want to hear your perspective about an experience we're having now as an organization. We had our funders that we worked with in a past project for 3 years. And at the end of the program, we were asked to bring recommendations. And from what we recommended as the outcome, they now embarked on another project, though we were not involved. But they mentioned and included our country as part of beneficiaries of the project. So after this is the second year now, they now called us again to come and review the impact of the project. But in reality, the communities, the real bottom down beneficiary, the people at the bottom of the pyramid who are supposed to be the true people impacted by the outcome, didn't even subscribe to it, not to talk more of being engaged. But the news and the outcry out there is that they are doing so and so in so and so countries with so and so people. And now they now asked me to be one of the expert reviewers to share recommendations, way forward, outcomes, blah, blah, blah. So, and we are here talking about trust-based philanthropy. If I go ahead, because the funders in the past, I want to please them and share things that they would like to know. Do I do that, or do I follow my conscience and tell them the truth? Despite the fact that the government embraced what they asked them to do, and it's all over the news that they are doing it, but in reality, it's not doable, it's not feasible, it's not on ground. At least with the people at the bottom of the pyramid, who they are hyping to be the beneficiaries. So I'm now seeking everybody's audience in this forum. If you were in my shoes, what do you do in a situation like this? Do you bluntly, without minding whose us is God, whether your government is going to feel the impact of your recommendation or your report, or them, the funders, tell them to their face that this thing you're doing is not working here. This is not how we do it, and this is not how it's going to work. If you really want to help us, just like Innocent said, do it the way we do our thing. Don't just do it the way you think or you assume it should be done. So I really want to hear people's perspective, because this is the situation I am in now. I'm even giving time between now and November to report back. But how do I report something I know is not good? How do I talk about and encourage something because my government accepted funds from you and is doing it, but I know in reality people didn't even weren't even engaged It's just out there in the news, but hear from everybody's opinion on how to go about this kind of scenario. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your experience, which is really tricky. So please do drop whatever reflections that we can have on what Asika Ralua shared in the situation that she's in. And Katherine, if feel free to just drop in at any point. Mamta did ask if if there's been a possibility of a negative outcome at a point of trust, trust-based kind of working. And maybe one thing that I wanted to say is that trust-based philanthropy comes with a lot of advantages, but it also does come with a lot of cons if it's not handled well. And if people do not start from a point of stewardship, I would say, because trust-based philanthropy does not eliminate accountability, but it looks at it from a more relational and solidarity-based kind of arrangement. So I may not share my experience directly, but I just wanted to highlight that in response to your reflection, Mamta. Katherine.
Yeah, that's it. I really appreciate you say that because it's interesting. We are having this conversation at the Global Fund for Children around, whether we asking reports from our grantees, that does align or not align with trust-based practices. But in reality, it is an accountability practice to sort of share like what happened with this possibility of being able to resource your organization in an unrestricted way, and actually it helps to learn and getting that information. It helps us to learn like how beneficial it is, or like what are ways to improve, right? So I think I totally agree with what you said. I think the other thing I would say about maybe an example that comes for me is that we did support an organization in a trust-based way. And this is another organization in Guatemala. And I think the thing that we also were also trying to improve our criteria, like who we were. And I think the more we did that, and I say this because, we talked about supporting women's rights or women's access to participation in things. And there was a completely male-led organization that only that would say, yes, they support women's work, but really it was just counting numbers of women who attended a workshop, right? It wasn't really necessary fostering an environment where women can become leaders, right? And I think where we became clear with our criteria is like, actually, it's not like what we are looking for is feminist leadership values, which means that there is a commitment from the organization to foster leadership that is diverse, right? That is not just men, but it's not just women, it's like LGBTQ, it's all the genders. And so, and I think that clarity for us helped us to then have that be more transparent with the organizations. And, ultimately we just, that grantee, for example, was no longer aligned with that clear criteria, so we transitioned out of that relationship. But I guess just to say, like, there is onus on us, on the grant makers, to be just really clear about what is the change that we're seeking to do, and be transparent about that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Katherine. Our time is fast spent, but Francis' hand has been up for a while. Francis, if you could just keep it really short, and then we can unfortunately bring this to an end. At the end of each of these sessions, somehow it feels like time is not enough. Over to you, Francis.
Thank you, Imelda, for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you, Catherine. In your experience phase, long-term relationship, was a recurring theme, and I thought I should follow it up. Traditionally, we knew that a long-term relationship in funding can evolve and develop through a process. It could be a pilot project of 1 year or 6 months being evaluated and then leading to scale. But also it can evolve and develop from short term to medium term and long term. So in this current trust-based philanthropic funding arrangement, what has been your experience in a long-term funding relationship developing in the partnership, maybe between a funder, a group of NGOs, or a bilateral kind of partnership? I Have you got my point, my question?
I think, well, maybe I think I'm understanding it like what are
I can rephrase it that
yes.
we know that organically long-term funding relationship will emanate from a pilot project to scale. But also it can be short-term, medium-term, to long-term. So my question is, under the trust-based philanthropic funding arrangement, how does this long-term funding relationship evolve and develop?
So I think it goes back to what is it that the grantee's long-term vision is, right? So it's not so much on what like I think there's a vision in, at least I'll speak from the experience of being on Thousand Currents, because there was a commitment to 10 years of unrestricted long-term support. And we would partner with organizations. I don't think we would partner them actually at the pilot phase necessarily, because we would work with the organizations that already had a long-term vision and strategy in place. So we would just accompany them in that journey. And I think they were the ones who sort of dictated like what their journey was going to be, and we accompany them by just mobilizing resources and seeing what was like the non-financial support that we could provide that could amplify, but it's always dictated by their terms. I think the thing that does evolve, and I don't know if this is answering your question, but like one thing that we learned in being in long-term relationships is that they actually, some of these groups would just tell us which other groups to support because they worked in partnership with them. So then they would be, if they worked in an ecosystem of peers, they would recommend us those peers. And then it would be an interesting case of being able to support an ecosystem of organizations that were already collaborating, which actually allowed potentials like, you could say, scaled impact. So that's kind of a benefit of supporting long-term relationships.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We are coming to a close, and again, thank you for sharing your insights, and feel free to continue dropping your reflections in the chat or connect with us on LinkedIn, and also share what else you'd like us to explore. There are a lot of things that we can explore. We'll also request that you drop in the chat what some of the reflections that you are taking along with you from this phase. And I think for me, one of the central reflections I am taking away is that trust must travel across the entire development and humanitarian ecosystem. Yeah, it cannot just begin and end with the funder, but also the intermediaries, the international organizations, the community-based organizations. We all hold power at different points in the chain. And if each of us holds power, then each of us, therefore, should look at relationships, accountability from a point of mutuality and learning orientation. Yeah. But also at PRA, we believe this kind of change really requires unlearning, yeah? Because a lot of things we go through in the development ecosystem, we are not able to name them, yeah? But when we surface some of these assumptions that we have inherited and also disrupt them, we are able to reframe different ways of working. So as we leave today, I just want to invite each of us to one reflective question, and that is, what is the one practice, decision, or relationship within your sphere of influence that you are going to begin to approach with more trust? You can drop that anywhere, share it on your LinkedIn, and we'll be able to interact with you. So as we bring this session to a close, it also marks the close of this first cycle of the Collaborative and Learning Labs. And learning from this cycle, we have been working and we are continuing to work on a modular kind of unlearning lab from all the feedback that we have gotten. And most of it was that at the end of every session, there's still a lot that needs to be reflected, and there's a lot that needs to be discussed. So we are working with our unlearning collaborators, and we are putting together modular-based learning cycles that are adapted for the funders, adapted for the intermediaries, and also adapted for the CBOs. Because we also realize that this kind of conversation may not be comfortable for different partners at different level. It would be a safer space when the reflections are held within different levels within the ecosystem. Yeah. So we invite you to keep in touch and look out. We should be putting that out very soon, and we hope that you'll join us in September. We are looking to start the cycles in September, and we are very excited for you to just interface with what we are putting together. Katherine, thank you once again for generously sharing your time, your experience, and unlearning and learning with us. And of course, to everyone who joined us, thank you for bringing your curiosity, your honesty, and your willingness to reflect. We look forward to the next session in September. But let's not stop there. Feel free to keep interacting with us. We share a lot of content on our social media as well. Share your reflections with us. We have a WhatsApp group. We have a LinkedIn page. You can also just reach out directly to any of us. I would love to have a conversation. Yeah, I would like to wish everyone a great day. And for any other questions in the chat, we are going to compile this into an insight session, and we can reach out with a summary of our discussions, but also responses to some of the questions from the chat that have not been fully responded to, and we'll look at integrating that in the next sessions. Okay, so please enjoy the rest of your day, your weekend, till September. See you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.